It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. Take Command Podcast. Logan Paulsen there. Craig Hoffman here. 53 players on a Commanders roster somewhere over there, and 17 more on the practice squad, Logan. We got the roster. It'll probably change again before next week as the roster churn continues around the NFL. It's always a bit of a, one into the next, the pinball effect of like, oh, wait, that guy's free now. We like him. But for right now, it seems like they've got a 53 that they like. They clearly had a bunch of guys they liked on their initial 53 as they made no waiver claims. They do sign Noah Brown, trade John Ridgeway since the 4 p.m. deadline on Tuesday, Logan. And we're going to dive into it all.
Yeah, no, I think it's, it's funny, like the roster, they always say it's fluid. And I think it will remain fluid until they play Tampa Bay. I think, there's guys that are going to come up, guys that are going to kind of go through their due diligence on. So I think there might be a couple minor changes, but, it's cool to kind of see the 2024 roster and it's what is going to be close to its final version, which is nice.
Yeah, for sure. I would say at least 50 of the 53, if not like 51 or 52 of these guys, if not all 53, are going to be the guys that play against Tampa. The day to watch is next Wednesday. Wednesday when they open practice, that'll be the roster for the week. They could always change it again after week one, and injuries and things pop up. We know that a roster's fluid throughout the season, but I think that where we should start, Logan, is bigger picture. Like, what did we learn about Adam Peters and how he wants to put together a roster, at least for this year? And the refrain he kept going back to in his press conference that I thought was interesting, but was never more explicitly followed up on. And I don't know what he would have said or, whatever, if he had been. But he kept saying we're going to do what's best for the team. And so that was trading John Ridgeway. That was, at that time, they hadn't even signed Noah Brown yet when he gave his press conference. But he was asked about, would we make like a bigger type of trade? Or, and Standig, who asked the question, kind of hinted at the Brandon Ayuk situation still floating out there. And so every single answer for DQ and for Adam could kind of come back to that refrain of we're going to do what's best for the team. That's a dynamic statement, though. It can go in a lot of different directions. When you try to look at this roster and what they did, what do you think is in Adam Peters' mind? If we try to go into it, what is his version of what's best for the team right now?
Yeah, I haven't talked to Adam about this or anything like that, so this is all just pure speculation. But I just go off a lot of what happened in 2017 when I was in San Francisco with him too, and the team building philosophy seems very similar. And what I mean by that is like there was a couple guys that were older that I think were better football players at the time, and then they kind of bank on a young developmental piece. So I think you see that here, and you kind of say like, obviously KJ Henry, like we were just talking about, is probably, if you had to win a game tomorrow, is the guy you'd want. But Jean-Baptiste was coming on really strong. He's this long, traitsy, tall, athletic guy who was starting to make plays in the preseason. Jamin, the explosiveness, guys that I think you're looking for upside. So when they say best for the team, I don't think it's best for the team necessarily tomorrow. I think it's best for the team 6 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, because you're kind of hoping for a developmental arc, and that's ultimately what you're gambling on. Because if you hit on a gamble like that, which I think is gamble, makes it sound like, it's a little bit like we're throwing something at the wall and hope it sticks. It's an informed estimation of a player's development, I think, and one that
they have control over on some level. DQ talked about that yesterday, of that, like, hey, we're looking to develop these guys. Like, this is part of the fun is to see where they are in a couple of weeks. Yeah,
100%. And I think like those two defensive ends specifically, I think are really good examples of that, right? Like Jamin is not ready just yet, but I do think based on how he's looked through the last 3 preseason games, week 2, 3, 4, like you're looking at someone that's going to make a significant impact to this team as a pass rusher, right? I think same thing with Jean-Baptiste. He's for sure a rotational guy now, but I think if you look at, again, the development in the Miami game and the New England game, the value he brings on teams, I think that's the other thing that kind of stuck out to me, and Fred Smoot mentioned this a lot on the Command Center show, was just the flexibility. Like, KJ Henry, not the best special teams guy, but Jean-Baptiste was making plays on kickoff coverage, on punt. Jamin Davis can play a little linebacker, can play teams, can play defensive end. It gives you some options in this team. So so when I say it's best for the team, I think it's best for the team long term. And I think there's something very obvious about that statement, because when you're making a team, like it's definitely not what's best for the individual, right? Because if it was best for the individual, like that person would be on the team. So it's always
everybody makes the team. Yay!
Right. And so I think like that's kind of an obvious statement to me, but it does kind of encapsulate to me this idea of like we're kind of making upside plays on a lot of these athletes. And the other thing I thought was just important to point out, I don't know if they've finalized practice squad yet, but seeing some of the guys they've mentioned that they want back, it also makes me excited, is just because, again, there's a lot of developmental upside there too. So I don't think it's like win now, win tomorrow type of mode. I think we're looking to get some developmental pieces of guys we like and we can trust. And I think that is what's best for the team in this instance.
Yeah, and they have, they have released the practice squad. Obviously, that could change, but we will get to that as we go through position by position. I'll make sure that we have those guys as well as the guys who made the 53. But I think it definitely points to, at certain positions, like traits and upside being the thing that they are willing to swing on. And I'd be so curious to revisit this topic in 3 years when they're hopefully competing and be like, okay, well, did they make the same decisions, or would they be a little safer, if you will, not as much of the upside play? Because while it's not true, like gambling, lottery tickets, playing, whatever, like we're not relying on ping pong balls here. There's some control over the process. We know realistically the chances that 7th round picks or a guy who's 4 years into his career converting from another position, like the chances those guys turn into stars are slim. And if they're not going to turn into stars, like, don't you want the kind of the solidity of a KJ Henry? Like often that's what you're looking for. Well, yes, but maybe not if you're at this stage of the rebuild, right? So when we think about what's best for the team long term and taking that shot, giving yourself the bandwidth, and to me that's a lot of what this year is about, and looking at a couple of different decisions that Adam made and funneling them into one common theme is giving themselves the bandwidth to find stuff out, giving themselves the bandwidth and the space to figure out, okay, on paper, like if we were looking at Jamin Davis as a pass rush prospect in the draft, and he did, got his testing numbers, like that dude's like a 2nd round pick as a pass rusher. You'd be like, he's raw, but we'll figure it out. Like how much different is he than Chop Robinson, right? From like a height, size, weight, speed, arm length, like they're actually not that different. And Chop, from a production standpoint in college, it's not like he had a ton of production. His pass rush win rate stuff was really nice. So I'm not saying that they're the same player, but the point is, like, you're giving yourself a shot. And if you keep a KJ Henry and you're charging the coaching staff to go out and try to win games, like KJ would get reps over Jamin and over Javonte Jean-Baptiste, even if you kept all of them. Right. And I think the same thing is true at corner. I've talked about this a lot with fans who are upset that they didn't go harder after Stephon Gilmore. And it's like, if you sign Stephon Gilmore, Emmanuel Forbes doesn't get the opportunity to get better and to prove if he's good, or frankly, if he's not. Right. And if he's not, then you have to address that position in a different way next year. The kind of resources, you're just much more informed going into year 2. And I think I appreciate the practicality of that, where I think they've done more than enough to float this year. I don't think that they're going to be a 4-win team, a 3-win team. And especially offensively, I think they are solid enough and they will be smart enough. I said this last year, but smart enough from a play calling standpoint to make sure that Jaden's development is prioritized and that there's a long-term vision for that. But they've definitely given themselves a shot to have Forbes turn it around, to have to have Jamin or Javonte Jean-Baptiste flash and like get enough reps in both practice and games to learn some stuff and see, oh my God, we stumbled into a star. Like you're going to do that because you didn't just try to maximize this season, squeeze out one more win in a year where you're probably realistically, with a rookie quarterback, not going to be contending anyway.
Yeah, and I think, I think back to 2017, and I also think back to 2010. That's the first time I was here, like kind of for rebuilds, in Washington and rebuilds in San Fran. And I do think that there is something to kind of like, I made the team over 2 veteran players, you know what I mean? Because they're looking at upside, right? And then when you're in San Fran, like I remember there was a rookie 7th round safety, there was a 6th round nose guard, and all these guys that ended up making the team. And it was really interesting in retrospect because like some of those guys hit and they become starters, and one of them became like a big high price free agent, the 6th round nose guard. You're like, oh my gosh, like didn't see that coming. Like when they signed him, Kendrick Bourne, is that name familiar to you? Like he plays in New England now. He was a receiver that was undrafted and was on the team, and kind of like a little bit of a goofball. And you're like, man, is this guy going to figure it out? And Kyle was like, we're gonna invest and grow, and he became a starting receiver for the team. So I think, like, again, to your point, like you got to kind of roll your dice on some of these, and every year teams do this to certain degrees, right? Like Philadelphia, for example, they draft Johnny Wilson, right? We talked about him a ton. Like they're rolling the dice on a guy because of traits, and they're going to let him play a lot because of traits. And so I think to your point, they are in a position this year where they can do that. And the other thing I want to point out too is like, Jean-Baptiste in the last game, to me, was not that far off from KJ Henry. So if it's close, it's like, why not take the guy we think's got a higher ceiling? And we think he's got a higher ceiling not because of the play right now, but because of the traits like you're talking about. And I think you're always doing things like that. You know what I'm saying? You're always saying, so that's one example of that. But I think at running back also, they went more conservative. They were like, hey, we're going to go B-Rob, we're going to go Austin Eckler, we're going to go McNichols, right? And so there are different philosophies and different times to kind of roll that dice, but I do think it can pay off down the road. I think another great example is Tyler Owens in terms of roster construction, right? That guy for sure, huge ceiling. Is he ever going to figure it out as a safety? I don't know, but he definitely showed enough in preseason to warrant the opportunity. So you just go down the list and you kind of find those opportunities.
So I'm glad that you said that about the running back position, because I feel like offensively they were a little bit more conservative, which tracks to try to put a floor under a rookie quarterback.
Sure.
Right? You want that veteran who's got the know-how, who's going to be your third down guy potentially and help out with pass pro, right? In Jeremy McNichols versus a rookie who showed great flash in Michael Wiley. And also practically, like, not every position's the same. There's all due respect to all the running backs out there, like there's a ton of running backs. There's a ton of guys that are just not that different. Wiley, I think, could be pretty good if given the opportunity. But there's a ton of guys, I don't want to say like roaming the streets, but like there's a ton of guys that won't be on teams that, if given opportunities behind the right O-line, could average 4 yards a carry in the NFL. There's more of that caliber of player. And so to take a guy, like the risk of that he wasn't going to get to practice squad basically didn't exist. And so you can keep both. I think also on the offensive line, you look at like Michael Dieter, didn't have the greatest spring. I think you can make a case that based off the merit of what they saw in the summer, that Julian Good-Jones, who they did wind up bringing back on practice squad, is better than Michael Dieter, or he was better than Michael Dieter. But Dieter just has a veteranness that if all of a sudden something, God forbid, happens to Tyler Biadasz, they want that veteran center. That's part of the reason you bring in Biadasz with the rookie quarterback. And so I think some of these more strategic decisions, when we go back to the original like premise of this segment, if you will, of like, what does Adam Peters mean by good for the team, is it depends. Some places we're willing to take on a little bit more risk. Some places we're being super practical. And those two things, by the way, kind of go together in an odd way. And it also depends on what the focal point is for each unit. And on offense, you got to make sure you have enough to surround Jaden Daniels. And then on defense, it's like, we have great coaches with a long history of fantastic development. Let's take some swings.
Yeah, 100%. And, it's, again, I think you're kind of looking at developmental play upside on the defensive side of the football there, because they are young players, and I think about, like, this is a high school adage, but like, show me how many sophomores you start and I'll show you your win-loss record. You know what I mean? And like, so there are going to be some growing pains even here in the NFL with young football players learning and adapting to the NFL game. But I think if, like, for example, if some of these young football players that we're talking about, Forbes figures it out, or Dominique Hampton ends up playing as like the dime linebacker and he has a role and he becomes that Javon Curse analogous, like, those are significant contributions to the team moving forward.
Just J-Ron Curse.
J-Ron, sorry.
Javon Curse. If he turns into Javon Curse.
Yeah, if he's playing dime linebacker, we're doing all right. But yeah, so I think like those types of additions, those types of kind of investments are super important. And I think it's part of the dynamic process of building a team, is you're always kind of weighing veteran versus youth, veteran versus upside. And again, I think you hit that really nicely there in terms of saying offensively, it seems like they were a little bit more conservative. And then defensively, obviously much younger. You know, you're going to start a rookie nickel. You're going to start a second-year corner. Like, there's a lot of stuff there that they're looking for in terms of upside.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let's take a look at the offense to get started with the 53-man roster. Logan, they decided to keep 3 quarterbacks, Jaden Daniels, Marcus Mariota, and Jeff Driscoll does do enough to make it. I also wonder how much this has to do with Mariota, the groin injury. They've said he's going to be fine and good to go and back up. He was out practicing yesterday, wearing number 18, by the way, the great number switch of roster cut day. Mikey Sanders still goes down to number 0. Mariota takes 18. De'Ami Brown winds up keeping 2 for those that are keeping track. So yeah, I think it's an interesting choice, but I also loved what Dan Quinn said about this, which is basically, I liked the room. And I think a big part of this, honestly, based off that quote, this is me extrapolating like a sports talk radio host should, but is saying, like, we don't want to change the environment that Jaden Daniels is essentially being raised in the NFL is. If Jaden is thriving with having Mariota and Driscoll and this group of coaches and Sam Hartman, who they bring back on the practice squad, let's make sure that room stays exactly like it is and see if that growth continues at the fantastic rate it has so far.
Yeah, and I think it's to me it's probably more injury related, because I think you could have kept him around on the practice squad. I think you could have kept Sam Hartman around on the practice squad also. But I think that's a great point. I think you want to keep an ecosystem around the young quarterback that allows him to grow and develop and feel comfortable. And so obviously Mariota has been highly touted for that. Even Sam Hartman's been touted for that. And I do think Driscoll played well enough. And if the injury is an issue, I think it's nice having a security blanket. And I think seeing him move around and seeing him do some stuff, I'm not saying they're going to, like change the offense, but I think he could be very successful in an offense that's analogous to what they did in Philly, like with the zone reads and the quarterback runs, because he's a bigger body guy, kind of built like Jalen Hurts. So I do think there are some advantages to keeping him around in the building, and I think he could be very successful in this offense if he had to play. So I like that they did it. To me, I think it probably feels more injury related, but I do think he played well, and I think you saw the athlete and you saw the physicality that he plays the position with. So, I think this is a great move.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And it's not like I look anywhere else in particular and be like, oh my God, they're so short at X position. Linebacker, yeah. I guess we'll get there. But there's some kind of asterisk caveats to the linebacker position that we'll get to as well. The running back position was one that played out exactly like I think we thought it would by the end, which is Brian Robinson, Austin Eckler, and Jeremy McNichols. They also, on the practice squad, bring back Chris Rodriguez, which I like a lot, and then Michael Wiley as well, Logan. What do you make of what they did at that running back position?
Well, I think it's kind of the thing you just talked about, like with doing what's best for the team, doing what's best for the quarterback's development. Like, obviously, Austin and B-Rob are going to be the guys, but I think having that veteran experience in the backfield as a pass protector and a guy who's been around the league and been through some tough times and been with some different teams and knows offense and, I think is willing to like run hard and get some tough yards for you and is a special teams guy is the right move. I don't think you want your backup third down running back to be a rookie. I don't think you want that. As much as Wiley did in the preseason to kind of say, oh, look at him run, look at him catch the football. I don't think he was ready to surpass Nichols in this example. And I think it's great because you get to keep him on practice squad, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I think it's also nice having Chris Rodriguez in the fold there because I do think I honestly didn't think they saw the value of him. But I think after seeing them keep him, seeing them keep Wiley, it's like they kept 2 backups for both spots. They're kind of their big back and their pass catching back. And I think that's the other thing about McNichols that's interesting is I think he fills both of those roles on game day if in a pinch if you had to because of an injury. But having 2 guys on the practice squad that could elevate into one of those roles respectively, I think is probably pretty advantageous. So I think I like the room. I like they're able to keep some young talented pieces around. And again, I think it's more reflective of their confidence in the experience of McNichols to come in and do both things because it's interesting on the depth chart they're listed as 2 different positions almost. It's like running back 1 and running back 2 on some depth charts that you see. So I think they view them that way, and I think they're different skill sets. So I think it's good to have a guy that can do both on the 53, and then 2 guys on practice squad who could do one of each.
Yeah, it's worth noting at this point that they can, if they want to on a game day, call Rodriguez or Wiley up. So if they know, for instance, that they're going to go super run heavy on a game plan in a given week and they want to have an extra back to spell, they could do that. And both those guys, Wiley and Rodriguez, played some special teams. Chris played it last year. Obviously, Wiley's a rookie, but both did it in the preseason. So that's worth noting that if they were to be called up, like they could be active and useful, and that's great. The other guy that they did keep is Kaz Allen. So despite the kind of lack of playmaking, despite some of the mistakes, I think it was pretty clear they wanted to kind of push forward with the running back, slash roll, experiment. And they are able to do that on practice squad. I'm curious to see if they have any weeks where they call him up and try to use him in that Debo Samuel role, to use Cliff Kingsbury's term. Again, Cliff did clarify, I'm not saying he's Debo, but the role of having him being able to line up anywhere. But I also feel like it's not a long-term project, but something that needs to continue to be developed, because it didn't work in the preseason in the limited number of snaps that we saw it.
Yeah, and I think if you look at his college film, obviously I watched him when he was coming out. Like, he does a good job with like space runs. Like they're not like trick runs, but they're like pseudo draws. They're like pin pulls off a zone read. So there's a ton of air. There's a ton of blockers covering you up. And obviously, like, once he finds a crease, he can do some damage, and he did some damage at UCLA. So I think it's interesting because Debo is big enough that he can kind of do all the stuff that Kyle wants to do. He can run gap scheme. He can run outside zone. I think Kaz Allen's a little bit more specific, obviously. So I think while Kaz needs to show what he can do, I think also understanding what he does well will help kind of accelerate this process. And I think having him on practice squad, I think will be very advantageous to, again, establish what he does well and how best to utilize him in this role. And honestly, kind of determine ultimately if he's well suited or suited enough to do it.
I could see a situation where Kaz Allen is elevated in the middle of the year, like full to the 53, and they use him and he's making plays, and that's great. I could also see where after 6 weeks they want to sign someone else and they go, this ain't going well. Like the full realm of possibilities is there, but they do keep Kaz Allen on the practice squad. Tight end Logan. Colson Yankoff made it.
Yeah,
UDFA out of UCLA. He's going to be hosting a podcast with me in 12 years.
Yeah, hopefully, man. I mean, it was really interesting to watch that kind of go down. I think we talked about this a little bit, like how close it was or could potentially could be between Cole Turner and Colson Yankoff. Cole, I thought, improved tremendously over the course of the preseason, but I think he did have a couple errors or blemishes or mistakes that probably, in the weighing of this, favor Colston. And then also, I think the other thing is, like, I went back and did a film breakdown for Coach's Show, which is coming out this Saturday, and we did a breakdown of Tyler Owens. So I watched a ton of special teams, and so Tyler Owens is an absolute lunatic on teams, like doing stuff that you've never seen before. But the other guy that does a lot of crazy stuff on teams is Colson Yankoff. And so I think what you're looking at there is you're looking at, again, a little bit of an upside play, and it makes sense for the fourth tight end, right? Because you got your three guys that are going to play a lot. Then your fourth tight end is going to be predominantly used on teams, but he's traveling to games, he's on the roster, and I think you saw flashes of what he can do from an athletic standpoint. Because I think people forget, like, he was not a tight end in college; he played running back. So to see him transition from running back to this and start to pick up the nuances of inline blocking, to see the spaces of routes, all that kind of stuff, again, that upside feels like the right thing, because I think he can develop into something special, and I think the special teams scaffolding give him an opportunity to do that, at least in his first maybe 2 years. So I like this move. It makes a lot of sense to me, and obviously I'm bummed for Cole because I think he improved a lot over the course of the preseason. But ultimately, like, if you're going to keep four, that dude better be an absolute lunatic on teams. And I think the other thing is he also feels like a good backup for Ben Sinnott in terms of being able to play fullback, line up as a slot receiver. Right. Obviously, the running back background is really important. So I think, again, it kind of like McNichols, he can back up, the F and the Y in a pinch if he had to. That makes a lot of sense, and the team's value very, very high with him. So very excited for Colson, obviously. Yeah,
my thoughts on where this position might go changed when we talked about his special teams value, and this is the from a prediction standpoint, the one that I'm mad about, that I didn't just pull the trigger and put him on. I kept Turner on, And obviously that wound up being backwards because I was like, Yankov's definitely going to be on P squad if he gets through waivers, which I figured he would as a UDFA. And instead it was the other way. Cole Turner gets through waivers, and he is around on the practice squad. And I think that's a reward for him for doing it the right way all throughout the offseason. He played like his hair was on fire, but there's just a lack of ultimate production that try hard has to turn into something. And I think some big mistakes in the games when the lights were brightest probably is what is the separator there. All right, the moment that everyone's been waiting for, Logan. Let's talk about the wide receiver room. And everyone's psyched about this because they make a move after they name the 53, and that is to sign Noah Brown. Of course, the 6 that ultimately make it are Terry McLaurin, De'Ami Brown, Luke McCaffrey, Olamide Zaccheaus, Jameson Crowder, and Byron Pringle, which we kind of thought would be the case. That was actually the prediction that we made on the radio show, was those 6, with Pringle being the guy that just kind of stood out, having done enough, and the veteran savvy and the kick returner and the whole deal. They also keep Mitchell Tinsley and Bryson Tremaine on practice squad, which is interesting. 2 of the guys that are from last year's crop, or Tinsley's case 2 years ago, but guys that have been here that, Tinsley had a really nice game the other night. We've talked about Tremaine quite a bit, but I'm kind of surprised that there's no Rosemy Jackson and some of the other young guys who played pretty well. And there's just a level of evenness amongst that group. I thought they might lean towards some of the guys they bring in. And then, of course, Noah Brown. Let's talk about Brown separately in a second because I have a specific question for you on him. Yeah. But the 6 that they keep, how does that set up to support Jaden Daniels in year 1?
Yeah, I mean, I really like. I think the moving of Jahan showed a vision for the room that they want tough, competitive, smart dudes. And I understand that that's kind of the roster theme, but go down the list, man. Terry, tough, competitive, smart. OZ, tough, competitive, smart. Luke. Every single one of those dudes is not afraid to block. They play with tremendous urgency. They are where they're supposed to be when they're supposed to be there in route concepts. So to me, it's a very solid group. I know fans are probably like, oh, there's no true 2. We need to get more talented. And I'm not disputing that. But I do think that when you look at this group, they will definitely play better than the sum of their parts on paper. They are just football players. There's a consistency and a toughness to that group that you very rarely see in receiver rooms. And I love that because, again, part of it is from 2010 to 2012 when Kai was here, I played with Josh Morgan. I played with Pierre Garçon, dudes who would absolutely kill you if they had the opportunity in the run game and the pass game. They were absolute savages. So I really appreciate that type of play stylistically because there's going to be 3 of those dudes on the field at one time. Probably they're going to be 11 personnel. And talk about having a cultural identity for your team. You need receivers that are going to be the DBs are man, I wish I wasn't playing in this game right now. And I think that's what this group gives you. And I also love that they kept the 2 guys on the back end of the roster and practice squad. Bryson Tremaine plays exactly that way. Mitchell Tinsley plays exactly that way. And so it's 7, 8 guys that is what they do. And I think, again, I understand there's a lack of talent, but I look at the tight end room with Zach Ertz, and we've talked about this before. He's going to get a huge share of targets. So to me, it's Terry, Zach, and then you kind of intermingle your De'Ami Brown, your OZ, your Luke McCaffrey in the situation that best suits them. And I think you're going to have a pretty solid group here.
Yeah, I thought Adam was really sharp in pointing out yesterday that you don't really improve your team in August. You improve your team in March and April. Yeah. And they entered March and April with the idea that Jahan Dotson was going to regain form as a former number 1, or first-round draft pick, and it didn't work out. And there's only so much backup planning you can do for that kind of stuff. And so they ultimately made the decision to move on from Jahan based off of what they saw, which is a totally valid decision based off what we saw. And there's just not a lot you can do at that point to try to get a number 2 receiver in because those guys aren't available because they're on teams. That said, Noah Brown might come in and as soon as he can learn the offense and everything, elevate to that. Different body type, different caliber of player than perhaps the production certainly of these other guys. A guy that's had over 500 yards in the last 2 seasons in Dallas and then last year in Houston, averaged 17.2 a catch, 6'2", it's 220, can run. different kind of player. And Logan, the question I wanted to ask you more specifically is, what kind of challenge does he face to come in at this point of the year? We've talked about this before. When you left Washington, you went to Chicago, and it was like time to play because you got cut at the end of camp that year when your time in Burgundy and Gold came to an end, and had to learn an offense just in the same way that Noah Brown's going to have to learn this one. What kind of challenge does he face? And then ultimately, once he overcomes that challenge, what does he bring to the team?
Yeah, I think the one thing about the Cliff Kingsbury offense, at least so far, it seems like the guys pick it up really quick. I don't know if there's like not a lot of volume in, or the way he coaches it, or the verbiage makes it easier, but it does seem like, I would imagine, he'd have a relatively easy time picking it up, especially with guys who have been here. They can help bring him along, and I think they're going to be pretty invested in bringing him along. So I don't think it'll be too challenging. Maybe the quickest to be ready week 1. It's nice to have 2 weeks, kind of this pseudo bye week here with no game this weekend. It gives you more time to figure it out and learn it. So I do think he'll be fine. But if it's not this week, it's the following week. And in terms of role, like he's a really interesting guy. I went back and watched his last 5 games from last season, and obviously he didn't play in the last game of the last year because he was hurt. So that's another thing. He's kind of negotiating injury, back and shoulder and all this kind of stuff. But one thing that jumped out to me right away is he plays the way that this receiver room is going to be expected to play. Like, he's very, very physical. He's very urgent in the run game. Love to see that. He's got some suddenness as a route runner. He's got some good vertical speed. He reminds me of like a little bit more polished at the top of your route, De'Ami Brown kind of guy. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's tall, he runs fast. He's not the most consistent at the catch point, which was a little surprising given his body size. Like, he had a couple drops. Everybody's got drops, but just not super consistent at the catch point. So I think there's going to be some developmental stuff there. But can he help your team? Absolutely. He's a good football player. Absolutely. And I think when you compare him to a guy like Bryson Tremaine, I think the athlete is better. The vertical speed, the suddenness is better. And so that's why you probably make that move, is like he's got the size, but he also moves a little bit better for a guy that size. And like you said, he's been very productive. And you watch, I think it was a Cincinnati game last year. I mean, he had like 140 yards receiving or something like that. And again, those are schemed up touches. It's not like he's winning one-on-ones consistently, but you need guys like that in your offense. So to me, maybe Terry's the one. And then again, he kind of falls into, maybe De'Ami's the vertical guy. Maybe he's the comeback guy. Maybe, whatever. And I think you just kind of find a role for him. And I think he's a little bit more nuanced as a route runner, which is nice. It's a skill set that fits the room. It's a personality that seems to fit the room based on play style. So I think it's a nice addition. I just don't, if you're a fan, don't get crazy and carried away to say this is the number 2 guy. I think he's got I think he kind of falls in line with the rest of the guys, like with the OZs. And, OZ had 600-yard receiving 2 years ago in Philly. Like, that's what he reminds me of, a guy that in the right situation can be very productive for your offense.
Yeah, I think the goal long-term is that he probably becomes the 2, but that could be a more long-term thing. Like, he's not going to step in week 1 and be the 2 for a number of reasons, including that shoulder, which he hasn't played in the preseason. Like, part of the reason he's available is because he was hurt and banged up and couldn't get on the field and prove that he belonged closer to the top of that Texans receiving room, which they obviously revamped in the offseason. So, certainly, I think we're all hoping he can be on the field sooner rather than later. But it could be a couple weeks until he's really playing with a higher snap count. And then we'll see how he fits with Jaden not having the offseason, although Jaden seems to get along pretty quickly with pretty much everybody. But how that ultimately goes. All right, last thing along the offensive line, Logan. No major surprises here. Brandon Coleman, Nick Allegretti, Tyler Biadasz, Sam Cosmi, Andrew Wiley, Cornelius Lucas, Trent Scott. I think it was almost, we just didn't know what the injury status was there. So as we made some predictions, or said like, oh, did he make it? But turns out Scott's still there as the 4th tackle. Michael Dieter, and then Chris Paul. And I think Chris Paul is also the kind of interesting one when you talk about Scott, because we thought maybe he had surpassed him on the tackle depth chart, and that made Trent Scott expendable. Julian Good-Jones, the only offensive lineman they wind up keeping on the practice squad, so I think that's interesting as well. They could obviously add and swap some guys out.
Did they not sign Ricky Stromberg? I thought he was on there too. It might have changed.
I do not see Stromberg on the initial release. I can look that up real quick. Okay. But yeah, so what do we make of this offensive line group, where we're worried and where we feel pretty good?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the group we kind of thought it was going to be. You know what I mean? like approximately this. I think the Trent Scott thing makes sense because they don't know where Coleman's at. And if you're not sure where Coleman's at, you still need to make sure you've got a swing guy that can do both. And Scott has shown that he can do that. He showed that last year. So I think the main thing is like, where's Coleman at in his development? Will he play week 1? I don't know. I don't know if I'd feel super comfortable throwing a rookie in versus that Todd Bowles defense and how much they pressure. But if you feel like he's ready to go, maybe you're rotating series or doing something like that, or maybe you pick a softer landing point in terms of getting him in there. But I think those tackles, they make a lot of sense. I mean, that's kind of what we thought it was going to be from very early in the offseason. The interior honestly feels kind of the same way. You know, like I don't think there's really any surprises there. They go Dieter, even though he didn't like blow the doors off preseason. But again, like none of those other guys, Ricky Stromberg, Julian Good-Jones, like made a push to say that they need to be on the team over him. And I think Chris Paul, I'm happy to see that because I think early on it looked like he was going to have a difficult time making the roster, but he just kept plugging away. And I think that's a very deserved spot for him. So very happy for him that he's in there.
Yeah, for sure. And Stromberg, not on the practice squad. In fact, he's not currently on anyone's practice squad.
Okay.
A lot of Bears fans are clamoring, saying, "Gotta go get him." Like, yeah. Okay, you have fun with that, Chicago. Wish Ricky the best.
Yeah,
but yeah, so I agree. I think this is a group that potentially could evolve throughout the year. It's one that I expect them to put a lot more resources in next year, and they are just going to have to be cognizant of what they are right now, which is better than I think some people think. Like I was listening to the NFC East preview on the Athletic Football Show yesterday, and Derek Klassenberg, who I like a lot, just crushed them. They're like, "Oh my God," he's like, "Are they going to be 2023 Giants bad?" And I was like, "There's just no way that is the case."
I will say they're not very deep. The depth is a little bit of a concern. So if there's an injury, maybe they kind of drift in that territory. But I think when you look at, and this is like really nerdy stuff, you know, like there's the analytics of offensive line play. And last year, obviously, they weren't good. But when you watch down to down, like turn on the film, watch it. Yes. And you're watching 5-step drops, down in and down out. Like, so I think I've said this before on the podcast. I remember being in meetings with Kyle, and he's like, "I don't want a 5-step drop more than 5 times in a game." And we were doing it upwards of 35 times last year. You are exposing that group to so much difficulty and challenge. And when I watched them, I was like, they're actually in these reps when the defense knows. That's the other thing. When the defense knows it's a passing down, you're basically giving them all the advantage. And we were doing that every single play. And for them to be as consistent as they were, I was like, oh my gosh, like this group is, I know they're much maligned statistically, but they're playing better than the numbers would indicate. And it's kind of like interesting because you go back 2 years, 3 years, and they were like the darlings statistically. It was like, this is one of the best offensive lines in the country, blah, 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 blah. But when you watch it down to down, they weren't as good as they appeared. So when you watch the film, I think, you know, everyone gets on Wiley as being this, like he was fine last year. And I think if you are able to deleverage them and go from 35 times to 15 times, which is a much more reasonable number in terms of 5-step drop pass protection, because you're going to have quick game, you're going to have screens. I'm not saying throw the ball 15 times. This group will play better. Statistically, they'll play better. So, again, that's where it comes down to, with them specifically, Cliff and this offensive staff, and saying like, and I think in the preseason you've seen they've done a really good job. Like, have we even talked that Chris Paul started a game at right tackle after playing guard for the entire preseason?
Right, protecting Jaden Daniels, by the way, not just Jeff Driscoll.
And we didn't even talk about him. There was no pressure because we understood the ball needed to get out. We ran the football effectively. It's ridiculous, but you can insulate the offensive line, and you have to. And so I think when you look at the best offenses in the league right now, they have good offensive lines like Detroit, San Francisco, Kansas City, but they insulate that group a ton. They like the play callers there are excellent. So I think
so does the quarterback, and that's the other part of it that we've talked about in the past. That like sacks are a quarterback stat. Like if it's one thing to 5-step drop and stand there and pat the football, it's another thing to hit your 5th step and launch one down the field to Terry McLaurin. And Jaden Daniels is going to do that, and that is one of the. I'm not going to call it a concern, but the questions that I have is like, do they insulate Jaden so much that they don't let him use what is his number one superpower, throwing the deep ball? But I think Cliff is going to balance that, and I think that they'll set up stuff where like they have these slot fades that he can throw, and he throws as well as anybody. from day one, but they're easy reads, and if it's shut down, then he knows where to go. And so yeah, there's a lot of questions for sure about this offensive line, and the fact that we still don't know who's going to start at left tackle should be said out loud to acknowledge the fact that yeah, there is not like some stacked group, but I do think that if you're just looking at data based off last year, that data needs a ton of context, and I think you just did a really good job of providing said context.
Yeah, and I think the other thing this is a great point, and you brought this up, is the one thing Jaden Daniels, I think I slept on in the draft evaluation, but I was doing a film breakdown with Coach yesterday, and we were watching a couple plays that I picked, and he goes, the thing I love about him is he can accelerate his process immediately. So there's that play against Miami where it looks like man coverage, and they rotate to cover 2, and they're bringing in this fire zone, and he's supposed to work to the right, but he's working to the left, and he can tell right away that he screwed it up. And you're like, that would have been a sack fumble last year because he's got 2 free runners off the right side. He's looking to the left. He can't even see them. But his footwork was so good. Ball out. And it was like...
Yeah, the one that he threw out of bounds over Terry said?
Yeah. Yes. Like, I know I know he made a mistake. But the physical ability to say, oh, I did screw it up, and get my feet where I got to get him to get this ball out before the rush is even past the line of scrimmage, I thought, man, like that's going to save you 10 sacks this year, 15 sacks, like just from that physical ability of the quarterback.
For sure. And one other thing that this is kind of off topic, but that I want to circle back on, is one thing that has been impressive to me from Jaden in the preseason and in camp is his ability to extend plays and throw on the run, where last year at LSU, like often when he faced pressure, his response was to run. And he was just like, well, okay, if I can get past this dude, that's one less dude I'm going to have to run by later. Right. And he ran for a bleep ton of yards, and like it worked out all in all. Took a couple of sacks that perhaps, and maybe left some plays out there that he wouldn't if his process was different in terms of, okay, there's some pressure coming, let me escape the pocket and keep my eyes down the field. He didn't run in camp. Like he just flat out did not run, and he continually made plays off schedule in a way that was different than his process at LSU. So if that is something that he can do, and he can handle muddy pockets, which obviously you don't have to deal with in camp, and like some of the things that were questions coming out in a way that maybe he was being coached to do differently at LSU for whatever reason than he is here, and he just adapts to the coaching here and executes it at a pretty high level. Like that's a guy that, I mean, I don't think that you would have taken over Caleb necessarily number 1, but you feel somehow even better about taking him at number 2 than they did when they decided they were going to take him at number 2. Like that is a different caliber of player, and he was already good enough with what they thought he was to take him number 2 overall, and they were pretty sure that was the right move.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And again, like there's a lot of, I feel like I have to say this. There's a lot of speculation. Like these are all best case scenarios, right? Like he's shown in practice that he can do these things, and it's great. And if he continues to show that, better. If he struggles, the offensive line's going to struggle. The play caller's going to struggle. The team's going to struggle. But that's to be expected. There's going to be road bumps for a young player, right? And again, it's with the offensive line. It's a new group coming together. So we're not saying they're going to be the greatest offensive line of all time, but there is a world where Jaden looks significantly like, maybe not, again, like a top 10 player, but those developmental things you just alluded to are hit and checked off, and he looks good, and it helps the offensive line, and the offensive line is going to have their bumps in the road. But as long as the general consensus of that kind of middle of the field offense is better, then it's going to be fine. It's going to be like, they'll win 8-9 games. Great. We'll get into next year. They'll draft another offensive lineman. They'll draft a receiver, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. Like this is part of the retooling of this team and the re-identification of the organization, I think. So
yeah, for sure. And you know what? They might win 6 games and it's still fine. Like we don't know, but I do think the point about the offensive line is it's generally going to be fine in a way that, we thought it would be fine last year. But then a lot of circumstances that we just talked about undid it. I think that there's just a much greater grasp of those circumstances this year and a realism that might put limits on this offense in a way that if the offensive line was more skilled, if they were actually full of 5 great players versus like 5 guys that you're scheming around to make it fine, then that does put a lower ceiling on things. But that doesn't mean that they don't understand that and will maximize whatever is possible. And by the way, on some weeks they might maximize it to the tune of 40 points, and some weekends they might not score a whole lot because it's a week-to-week league. Matchups are different. Stuff happens. That's the NFL, baby.
Right.
Defensively, Logan, let's make our way through the three levels here. Defensive line was interesting in that they kept an extra guy, so to speak, to start in John Ridgeway. And Ridge earned that. I mean, he was great in that game against Miami. You could hear kind of the strain in Adam Peters' voice when he talked about trading him. And he's like, man, he was great. He pushed the envelope. And they ultimately get a 6th-round pick in return. They give up John Ridgeway in a 7th to New Orleans to get that 6th-round pick back. But you get Phil Mathis, Johnny Newton, Daron Payne, John Allen inside. And then it's funny because they insist on listing Dante Fowler as a linebacker. But realistically, on the edge, it's Cleveland Ferrell, Dorrance Armstrong, Javonte Jean-Baptiste, Jamin Davis. And we should also mention here is that just looks so thin on the edge, right? Especially if they're going to list Fowler as a linebacker. But Frankie Louvu should be mentioned here as well, because they're going to use him as an edge on 3rd downs in 2-minute, these pass rush situations. So how do we think that this group looks now as we enter the season with the power on the inside? And I think a lot of questions of guys that are in new roles are being asked to do a lot more of stuff than they used to do on the outside.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the starting group. I think is very solid. I think Dorrance Armstrong has the ability to. I don't want to put this on him, but I don't think this is a bold prediction. But I think he could be a 10-sack guy with more play volume. I think he's got.
He had like 8.5 last year.
Yeah, he's got that ability. So couple that with John and Daron and this kind of more penetrating system, I think that's going to be great. And then Cleveland Ferrell, I know he's kind of been up and down, in terms of how the league perceives him, but he is a physical, hard edge setting, pocket collapsing kind of guy, and I think that's a very solid starting group. And I think when you look at Fowler as kind of the rotational pass rush specialist guy, he'll probably play a little bit on 1st and 2nd down to spell those guys, but I think that's a very solid kind of starting 6. Then you get into depth. I think Big Phil played really well. I think the only question I have about this group is Jerzon, just because he hasn't played. You know what I mean? And that's where I thought they might want to keep Phil at least for a couple of weeks until Jerzon kind of figures it out. But this also goes back to your point about they want to develop guys, and the way guys develop, you can develop them in practice, but you got to develop them in game. And so Jerzon's going to play quite a bit, I would think. And then the other thing is Jean-Baptiste and Jamin, because of the depth here, are going to play quite a bit too. So I think that's important to acknowledge that there is going to be a little bit of a learning curve with that kind of second group, but I do think that they'll come along quickly. And if they do develop by week 5, 6, that could be a pretty formidable group. But I think that first group I feel really, really good about. First 6 players, Big Phil too, I'll throw him in there. But then there's a lot of developmental young pieces that will be interesting to watch.
I'm fascinated by how they're going to rotate these guys, because 1st and 2nd down, Furl and Armstrong are going to need to play a lot. And then who's kind of the third guy for 1st and 2nd down? Is it Fowler? Is it Jean-Baptiste? Do they see what happened with Jamin and be like, actually, he can kind of set an edge all right, and he can chase and tackle. Shoot, do we put him out there on 1st and 2nd down? Yeah. But I also think those guys can play a higher percentage of 1st and 2nd down snaps, because I think the starters, if you will, on 3rd down pass rush situations are Louvu and Fowler. Yeah. And so the fact that you're, if those guys are in there taking up a third of your snaps, in an ideal world, 1st, 2nd down, don't get a 1st down, 3rd down again, bang, bang, let's get off the field. They can go right back out there and be out there on 1st and 2nd down next time around. And so I think that's pretty fascinating. You have FA in reserve coming up a pup. They also on the practice squad keep Andre Jones Jr., so another developmental freaky type of athlete. A guy in Dubuisi, I hope I got that name right.
Dude, he had a really good game against New England. And
so he's their international pathway player, and the last practice squad spot, or one of your 17 practice squad spots, you only get 17 if you have an IPP player, and so he is kept because of that. But as you said, maybe he's a guy they could call up and he can play actual snaps for them.
I was actually really impressed with him because, again, he's usually the international pathway guys. They don't quite get football. But I don't know, when I watched him, he had a couple reps versus the starting center for New England and looked like a dude. And he's big. He's like 6'8". I want to say he's like 330 or 340, but he runs to the football better than anybody I've seen on the defensive line. Like, he is a maniac. And so that to me is a really interesting developmental depth piece there for them, because everyone says, oh, they got rid of Widgeway, they got rid of all this size, and I totally forgot about, how do you say his name? Ndubisi?
I'm going with Ndubisi.
Ndubisi, that's right. So, but I forgot about him, but he flashed in the preseason in a way that I was not expecting, because he's so new to football. But if that works out, like, there, like, to your point, like, I'm glad you brought that up, because no one's been talking about that. But that is a really interesting developmental spot there for him, and a guy I do think in a pinch you could call up, and he could play good football for you.
Yeah. The other guy that they have in the practice squad that they brought in, veteran, is Carlos Watkins, who played for DQ in Atlanta in 21-22. He was with the Rams last year on their practice squad. He's 30 years old, but he's 6'3", 305, listed as a defensive end. So a guy with some size that if you get in a pinch, that perhaps he's your guy that goes out there on the edge and is a bit of a bigger body to play first and second down. So that's the list as of right now. But I am just so fascinated by the rotation here and how they use Jamin, how they use Luvu, how they use Fowler. Like, how do these guys rotate in and out?
To your point, though, I think it's any way you cut it. So even if it's Luvu and Fowler, like, if Luvu's starting at defensive line, then that means Dominic Hampton's your linebacker, right? And he's or Michael, right? Like, you got some young. Youth is going to be a very big theme on this defense for sure. And there's going to be some growing pains with that, I think. And again, I go back to that. Show me how many sophomores you're starting. I'll show you your win-loss record, like that. And I trust Dan. I trust Joe Witt Jr. Like, this is not me criticizing them in any way, but with young players, even if they're very talented and good, it's an experience thing. So I could see this being a little bit of a rough road or a learning experience for the first couple weeks until they kind of find their stride and the rotations and things like that.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was interesting as we transition into the linebackers is listening to Class and Mays on the Athletic Football Show, is they were like, I think this is a slow defense. Like, there's not a lot of guys that run 4.5, 4.4,
just in general,
4.7 guys. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know about that because, like, Luvu's everywhere. He can run. A guy like Quan can run.
He didn't clock fast, but he plays fast.
He plays fast.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I saw him chase down like Marcus Mariota, who did clock well.
Yeah.
So like, I do think that there's maybe a little bit more speed than people out there realize on this team. You have a bunch of guys that play fast. Like, we'll talk about it at the safety position with a guy like Quan. Like, I just don't think the NFL. They saw early Quan Martin last year. He's a second-round pick. I don't know that the NFL appreciates Quan Martin. I think he could be the surprise of the year on this team. But at the linebacker position, they keep, obviously, Bobby Wagner, Frankie Luvu, Michael Walker. They list Fowler as a linebacker, and then Dominique Hampton there. DQ has consistently said, even though we haven't seen Jamin as a backer in a long time, he said, if we get in a pinch, like, we'll flex him back there. It sounds like they might practice him there a little bit just so he stays fresh enough if they need him. And then they also just signed to the practice squad. They literally just announced this, 20 minutes ago as we're recording, Logan. Jalen Graham is going to the practice squad, 7th-round pick out of Purdue last year, to the San Francisco 49ers. So this is your first Adam Peters carryover. But he's, 6'3", 220. So not like a huge linebacker at 220 pounds, but certainly fits the mold of what a lot of these guys look like in a Dan Quinn defense.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the speed thing that I go back to here is, like, a lot of like Jeremy Chinn's going to play in the box. Tyler Owens maybe play in the box. Percy Butler, I mean, he ran a 4.35 coming out. Like, they're going to find ways to make this defense fast, and I think that's something what I'm really interested to see, and we saw glimpses of it in practice, is Dan always talks about the positionless nature of defense in the NFL and how he's kind of moving to that basketball model to here. Like, I think we're talking about linebackers right now, but I think those safeties and the diversity they're going to play with the defense will be fast because of the body types they have out there. And I think the thing I'm concerned about is, like, how do those body types handle stopping the run consistently, like that type of stuff. So I think they're going to be plenty fast. Like, I'm not worried about that because of the personnel groupings they're going to use. It's how do they handle stopping the run with a little bit undersized, faster personnel And I think that'll be really interesting to watch. But I do think having John and Duran and some really established guys in the spine of the defense, as you like to talk about, and Bobby Wagner in there, obviously, will be very, very helpful. So,
yeah, I mean, that's the other big question, right? Is like, okay, well, you want to be faster, so you're going to play dime all the time. It's not like that doesn't come with its own set of problems. How do you solve it? And Dan, obviously, and Joe have done a lot of dime work in Dallas, and they were able to maximize. And we talked about this off the top, right? On defense, they're betting on the fact that they've had a great history of developing players. Like Deron Bland was a nobody who wasn't supposed to play last year. And then, oh my God, Diggs gets hurt. Trayvon Diggs gets hurt. And Deron Bland sets the NFL record for pick sixes. And not to say that Deron Bland was, the best corner in football, but certainly was effective. Certainly made you pay for throwing. Like you might got one, but he might get it back on you, and his might score more than your big play. So like their ability to find and mine gems on defense is a part of the plan. And yes, they will hopefully bring in more talent over time. But I do think that's a huge part of it. And I agree that when we talk about the safeties, typically we group the DBs all together. In this defense, it actually makes more sense to talk about the linebackers and the safeties together. And I think that they've gotten a bunch of guys that are pretty versatile, that you will see Quan in the box, you will see Chin in the box, you'll see obviously Hampton, who's now listed as a linebacker, in the box. Percy's played that Buffalo nickel in the past. They kept Derek Forrest, bigger body, who can spell some of those guys as well. So obviously Owen. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting to see how they rotate those guys. And then obviously on the back end, Logan at corner, Chigozie Anuzium winds up being on the practice squad, and then
excited
they keep.
for that.
I am as well. And they keep just the 5 listed corners: Mike Sanderstill, Benjamin St. Juste, Emmanuel Forbes, Michael Davis, Noah Igbenogany, and they also just brought in Bobby Price on the practice squad, so they have a little bit more corner depth there. What do you make of this corner group and what you're hoping to see? And I think really the question is, like, what do they do with Sanderstill? Is he purely a nickel, or in 2 cornerback sets, is he all of a sudden going to be playing on the outside?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I think that's the $1 million question. Much like the safety group and the linebacker group, kind of the packages, the utilization, even with the defensive line package utilization, I think there's a lot still that needs to be seen. And I think I was going to say finalized, but I'm sure they have an idea of what they're going to do there. And I think with the corners, it's the same thing. I think with youth and with new players, this is always something you got to go through, right? And so I know there's been talk about Sanders still bumping outside, and then when they're a nickel, he'll bump back in, and Forbes will come in or whatever. Like there's been a lot of speculation about that, and I think we just got to figure out what, and I think they got to figure out too. Like, can he play outside? Because as much as they talked about it, I didn't see him do a lot of outside stuff in
There's
the
a
preseason.
little, but there definitely was not. Like in practice, there was a little. I don't know that he ever took a rep outside in an actual preseason game, though.
Yeah, I think he did one, that I've documented. So like not a lot. So obviously they've seen him do that. There's stuff that he's done in practice, but can he do it against big body receivers? Mike Evans week 1, Mike Sanderstill's not a big dude. Like, how great do you feel about that matchup? I don't know. So these are all things that need to be determined. And that's something that, again, preseason's fun, joint practice is fun, but the game is the funnest thing because you get to see the execution of this stuff. And I think we have a general idea. Like we talked about Luvu as a rusher. We talked about Dominic Hampton as the big nickel. We talked about, some of the rotations they can do with the safeties and the different personnel you're going to see there. But to see it actually happen is the thing that I'm really excited for. And I think there's a lot of questions about that group, but I think it's again, because of coaching, like much like the offensive line with play calling, I think because of Joe Witt Jr., I think they will be better in the secondary. And I'm excited to see that actually happen over the course of the first couple weeks of the season.
I am as well. I'm very curious to see how it works in year 1, though, because this style of defense has been at its best, whether it's going back to Seattle, like the principles that Dan has used going back to Seattle that Joe Witt also agrees with and has been a part of with Dan in Dallas. It kind of relies on the coverage and the rush marrying. And the Seattle defensive line was sick. They had 8 dudes that they rotated through, and all of them were good at getting after the quarterback. They had Micah Parsons and Tank Lawrence in Dallas. And you just don't have that caliber of rusher. You don't have those hosses in DC this year, unless John and Duran turn it up to even higher levels than they ever have before, and they can generate pressure from the inside at rates that are, equal to what a Micah Parsons can do on the outside. That lets corners not have to worry about double moves and getting beat deep, and they can undercut routes and be playmakers in a way that, certainly Emmanuel Forbes, based off his history, should be very suited to do, but we haven't seen it at the NFL level. So that's my concern, is that the rush undoes some of what they are able to coach up, and that there's just too much time. But this is also a part that I'm just accepting of the multi-year project that I know that they will invest in moving forward. This is, as we said, off the top, to bring it all full circle, some upside swings along the defensive line at those edge positions. If one of them hits, then that changes the trajectory of the franchise, because it's one less massive draft pick or contract spend that you have to do at that position. But it is going to be a week by week adventure here as we get started, and we'll see where the ride takes us, Logan. We'll see where the ride takes us.
And I can't wait, man. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Anything else on the roster on anything before we enter our final week before the season?
No, I think that's it, man. We talked about that for quite a long time, which is warranted, because we've been waiting for this day for a long time, and now it's on to the next thing, which is week 1. I guess the kicker thing. The kicker looked good.
Yeah, Cade York. Hey, we finally, after all of those to be determined later lines on our roster projections, on the last one on the radio, I put Cade York. I think he's gonna do it, and sure enough. Cade York, for now, is the kicker of the Commanders. There's a couple of guys that are out there, but I think that Cade York probably at least earned week 1. We got a couple more preview shows, obviously, for the season next week, and then it's the season, which is cool. Can't wait for that. In the meantime, check out all the other stuff that we're doing. Of course, the Hoffman Show daily on the Team 980 from 4 to 7 p.m. We're talking about everything Commanders and anything else that happens to pop up in the DC sports universe. Command Center and all the Commander shows for Logan over on their YouTube channel. We'll see you next week back here on Take Command. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't yet, if you just found us, subscribe. The button's right there. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.